So we move on to the next talk. Great pleasure to introduce Dr. June Rain, again, who doesn't need introduction. You saw her picture on screen. June is Chief Executive of the MHRA, and June has been key to some of the developments in terms of fighting the COVID pandemic, but also is leading the development of the MHRA post-EU exit. And June is going to tell us about what the MHRA has been doing. June, thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much indeed, Samir, and thank you for the kind invitation here today. I'm humbled to follow Professor Van Tam, and I'd like to thank you for your kind words too, although I think that picture looked as if I was having a quiet snooze. I was very awake. It's a real pleasure to be here at the 8th Pharmacogenetics and Stratified Medicine Network, and it's marvellous to hear how this network is going from strength to strength, because these are exceptional times for science and also truly exciting times for regulation, and it's not often that you'll hear the words exciting and regulation in the same sentence. So my topic is, what is the next phase, moving on from COVID in regulation? Will this mean a new era for us, and what will it look like? And I'd like to address this by looking at three questions in particular, looking in a bit more detail at what the innovative regulatory response to the challenge of COVID-19 actually was, and how will the regulatory learnings from that help deliver access to innovation, and where next, strengthening our science base and optimising our international role. I make no apology for showing this 90-year-old grandmother again, because the 8th of December 2020 was a particularly special moment for us when Margaret Keenan received the first approved COVID-19 vaccine at University Hospital in Coventry. And that journey had taken approximately 300 days, rather than the usual years or even a decade. And yet it reflected international regulatory standards and guidelines, and subsequent approvals round the world by other jurisdictions were not materially different from that first approval. Back early in 2020, we knew that the government was then looking at a number of vaccines which could be in the clinic in 2020, which could be manufactured at scale, preferably in the UK, and be ready for deployment as rapidly as possible. And this kind of challenge could only be addressed by a whole-scale change in regulatory approach. And I'd like now to tell you a bit about that. Forgive the word process, it's not a word I like, but as well as empowering our people to be proactive, we overhauled our processes. We introduced regulatory flexibilities, reinterpreted legal frameworks, and new ways of working. We worked in partnership as never before. Having been a cog in a European network, we turned internal. What partnerships would we need to deliver? And we put patients and the public at the forefront, considering what the public's views might be and anticipating maybe a level of vaccine hesitancy in particular that might amount to as much as 50%. We looked at our own performance and continually monitored progress against goals and continued to plan where we could change. So it seems rather prosaic in this context, but everything had to be on the table for change. The law itself, we didn't need to change, but working with other regulators worldwide, we were able to exploit our flexibilities to the full. What did that look like in practice? As well as giving ongoing support for new developers, this wasn't launch and leave, it was maintaining a dialogue throughout, right through to real-time pharmacovigilance. And because that's so close to my heart, I'll say more about that in due course. But in between that beginning and that clinical deployment were agile inspections, a clinical trial approval time reduced to about a third in most cases, and even with the recovery, it was Sunday time working just to get that up and running, rolling reviews of dossiers, where it was needed. Surge resource, which the government helped with, but planning ahead for the batch release. Looking at the development timeline, before we even had our processes into gear, we were allowing those overlaps of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, so that they could begin before the previous phase was completed. And it was that kind of compression of timelines that meant we were able to start our regulatory work in a similar overlapping way. So the assessment teams worked quite differently. We'd already used a rolling review for emergency use, but not in such a managed way. We started in the middle of 2020, thank you Sir Munir again, by standing up an expert group looking ahead to what was to come, planning for the vigilance that would need to be operating real time as soon as a potential vaccine started to be rolled out in mass deployment. Our National Institute for Biological Standards and Control had the technology transfer and debated issues such as, do you need to batch release an mRNA vaccine? Important scientific questions that relate to how we will approach this type of new technology in the future. And as the data became available, preclinical, the quality reviews that were ongoing and very detailed, I have to say, and then by 3 weeks before that date in December, we had the interim analysis. And I have to say, not knowing what we'd be seeing when we saw those curves parting at about 7 days after the first dose, let's just rejoice again in what that technology delivered for us. I think one of the most memorable moments in a professional career, not knowing what we would have. All the work up to that moment done at risk. So that efficacy picture, I think, needs to be on all our walls as we inspire ourselves with the brilliance of what science can offer. So with all of that going on and the partnership working, let's think a bit about what is important about an independent regulator. We were scrupulous about our involvement with the Vaccine Task Force on general principles, on methodologies, but never on specifics. And at the right time point, when data began to accrue, being able to reinforce those important separations. You may hear or you may think that there are blurred boundaries with JCVI, but there again, I can assure you we observe one another's proceedings, but that separation is very clear and very real. Regulation follows the science and the science alone. We were very focused on the need for confidence in the independence of the decisions. And I have again to mention Sir Munir. You'll think we're all having photographs of each other here. If I can get the next one. It was really important to lift the bonnet on regulatory decision-making. No part was going to be held secret and not available for public questioning. And I think, Sir Munir, your role in making sure those communications were as open as may be has been immensely valued. Of course, there's a downside, and you may have seen the reports of increasingly assertive anti-vax demonstrations, and that is something that we will need to live with now that we're all, if you like, much more open and much more available. And a key challenge has been making that complex science accessible. We've put to good use some of the graphics that more able communicators than we are have been able to share, and being able to share in visual terms what being vaccinated means in terms of the symptomatic disease, hospitalization and death. And I really pay tribute to those who can take us into that realm of easily accessible data when the public have questions. So I'll turn now to the challenge of monitoring safety, so close to my own heart. And I've mentioned already that we planned our approach very early indeed. 4 main pillars that you can see there, but on the left, the tried and trusted yellow card, a spontaneous way that anyone who wishes to report can share their information with us. We modelled about 100,000 reports. We're edging probably to 4 times that amount now. And you cannot do that with teams of humans actually looking and scrutinising each one. So for the very first time, we employed the tools of artificial intelligence to help us translate rather rapidly the kinds of wordings used by the reporters and to be able to actually identify key terms that were coming in that would enable us to detect signals. And maybe it's for Sir Munir to comment on whether you think that's been timely enough. The inquiry next year will no doubt plummet that depth as to whether we have, in our ambition to be real-time, have we been really real-time? An important step forward for us was integrating Yellow Card with the NHS App, and there's more work to do there. We've all looked at how the public have embraced Zoe and shared a lot with the Zoe app, but the full vaccination record that you can access via the app can be a really important way in to reporting. So a key plank of our strategy going forward is going to be making that journey even easier. And then, as well as being more open, there was a bit of a political discussion as to whether we should publish all adverse drug reaction data. Caused a lot of nervousness at the higher echelons of government. But we prevailed, and every week the public was able to see whatever there was to see. And not only the reporting, but a really interesting and, I think, engaging explanation of the biases and the limitations, how many deaths you might expect when you vaccinate a very large population, to contextualise the reports that we were receiving. And the trends coming through engaged internationally with what other regulators were looking at. So I'd like to turn to a signal that may be of particular interest here, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia. We identified back in February this year, I think it was just 3 yellow cards of cerebral venous sinus thrombosis in association with the AZ vaccine. Concerning, yes, but at the time we were looking at a range of hematological abnormalities and trying to disentangle abnormalities that might be related to a vaccine from those related to COVID infection itself. So it's generally termed VIT, vaccine-induced thrombosis with thrombocytopenia. I have to say we prefer TTS because the vaccine-induced already attributes that causality. Investigation of individual cases was a real challenge. And indeed, many have reached the published literature, importantly, because it engages us all in the challenges our health professional community has in deciding whether or not to report. What you see here is that an initial MRI scan was void, or considered and reported to be void of pathological findings. But the PF4 was diagnostic, platelet factor 4, and 3 days later the CVST appeared and could be seen in the MRI scan there. And interestingly, with rapid immunoglobulin treatment and anticoagulation, this patient recovered. So early diagnosis and rapid management, vitally important. A landmark publication by Sue Pavord and the British Association of Haematologists really helped, I think, put on the map the importance of full investigation of a signal. Its rarity, I think we're now looking at 15 per million vaccinations, but a devastating complication. And I think you see here how important it was to be picking up those cases of CVST where neurosurgery would be required to rescue the patient. And the fatality rate in our yellow cards alone is 17%. So, very important, rapid identification, rapid investigation. And communication, and here's the challenge. The way that the age gradient was soon identified enabled some very important deployment decisions. Again, we collaborated with those that are good at communicating risk, and this was the Winton Centre in Cambridge, to look at representation of that age gradient in harm against benefit, against ICU admission, and against a background of the COVID risk at that time. And this depiction was February this year. You can see that a quick look tells you that at the age of 40, you jump down in prevention of ICU admissions, but up a bit in serious harm from the vaccine. So decisions to be made, and round the world, politicians too were grappling with this kind of information. Our role as a regulator, looking at benefit risk, we do consider very much the individual. JCVI looks at wider considerations at population level. And so it was in May last year that JCV advised that people under 40 should have an alternative to the AZ vaccine. And since that time, I think our caseload has virtually disappeared. Effective identification, risk assessment, risk management and mitigation, and elimination, according to yellow cards, I will say, of a really important potential harm. Coupled with colleagues in the British Society for Haematology giving advice on investigation so that at the clinical end there's a rapid and easily accessed guide to investigation. And then, of course, colleagues in NICE, our other partner in arms here, looking at the management. And I think it shows how the UK system, which to many people is a fragmented system, actually joins up really well when there is something that focuses everyone on a challenge, as was done then. And I pay tribute to colleagues in NICE. We don't normally associate NICE with the management of harms from an adverse reaction, but they stood up and they delivered. So now I'll turn to the ideas about change. Is the MHRA, our regulator, going to move forward from here? And I'm delighted to say our new minister, now in post, Lord Kamal, Minister for Life Sciences, is fully engaged in moving forward. And I really hope that that bodes very well. Political moves happen, but he has taken the baton from Lord Bethell and is carrying it with real determination. And central to the life sciences vision is our innovative licensing and access pathway. And it builds on that integrated approach that we developed and pursued throughout COVID. Launched in January after EU exit, it comprises innovative methods and tools operated in a very integrated way. And so we're working more closely with NICE than ever before. We spent a day with the NICE board yesterday and determined issues like data sharing. Now that might raise eyebrows in an audience where industry may rather wish to control what data is shared when, but when we have a determination to deliver important innovation rapidly, we must contextualize the risk of data sharing in that way. So for an innovative product, there will be a pathway, a target development profile with earlier decision-making, dialogue, repacing, advice, and scientific guidance, pulling products along that pathway so that by the time there is a positive benefit risk, as we've seen throughout COVID, particularly with dexamethasone, there is a positive step into clinical care. And for me, the take-home for the recovery decision on dexamethasone, results on dexamethasone, was that it became standard of care that day as soon as that analysis had been undertaken. Can we repeat this? Can we look at other innovations across what the life sciences calls the new epidemics or the other pandemics that we have? Mapped out, and it's a simple map. This goes from the early discussion, planning the target development profile, considering importantly what the patient's views are about patient-reported outcome measures, and so that there's an early engagement with what patients value, but also deploying better scientific tools and the in vitro diagnostics that may be companion to a particular new entity being looked at the same time. We heard earlier one of the questions that was put forward, concern about the diagnostics area, which is admittedly a fragmented one. We will overhaul the regulatory framework to put that integrated approach where it needs to be. What will we achieve as a result of this? What will be the goal? And we've set ourselves a goal of halving the time. I think it's still about 9.5 years for a product to reach clinical care. We've seen that 300-day achievement for a vaccine? Can we look at halving the time? And that's the determination we have with this accelerated a view of what data are needed and absolutely real-time assessment when they do appear. Just a quick word about our particular jargon, you might think. You might read about innovation passports, which I hope are of considerable value to developers. A target development profile, which is that pathway that we stick to and the developer adheres to, and a toolkit that's still growing of interventions and activities, all of which builds up to integration with health technology assessment and with the NHS. The first innovation was belzutifan for von Hippel-Lindau disease. We're still in the neurology territory. And that was a very successful partnership between the MHRA, NICE, and the Scottish Medicines Consortium. And the typical distribution of these hemangioblastomas, which are characteristic, you see very well here. It's a real step forward for a small population, but more to come in terms of those innovation passports, a much broader capture, diseases like breast cancer, which is the Trodelvy, and even I think there's a product there for osteoarthritis that may well deserve and merit, if it offers that promise, pulling through the system. A system that I think is now of its time, and I think will be the core of the new regulatory paradigm. Tools I won't go into in detail, but some very important themes there. Better use of real-world evidence. I think that's got to characterise all of our determinations, that we're not just simply relying on perhaps very lengthy clinical trials. And I'd like to highlight the clinical practice research data link, now picking up data from, I think it's 25%, just over 1 in 4 GP practices are donating data, and a recruitment ability for clinical trials that will really take time out of that task. Once a trial is approved, getting it up and running ASAP. So a sprint, if you like, it's called, the speedy patient recruitment into trials, has to have a name, starts with a search of all those data, those records, to consider where and how can we locate eligible patients. GPs then will decide who they're going to talk to about the potential to be in a trial, and they will invite suitable participants, if they wish, to contact the research centres. And this is the sort of approach that really will help to take time out at that vital stage when we know there's an entity, an asset, that is going to make a big difference to clinical care. I'd like also to turn to better science, and this is where I reflect back on that signal of thrombosis and thrombocytopenia, which I talked about earlier. And again, a name check of Sir Munir. It's all very well to detect a signal and manage it, but actually we need to understand it in scientific terms. And so a cross-disciplinary research consortium led by Liverpool University has a range of work packages, everything from platelet immunology right through to the epidemiology of this very severe adverse event. And what I think is of great interest to this network is the genetic work. The fact that already 74 people are available for whole genome sequencing, I think also RNA sequencing and T and B cell receptor sequencing. And in that data, we may find the way worldwide for this harm to be prevented. Yes, we have a superb haematology service. Yes, we have nice guidelines. But think of the rest of the world where the AZ vaccine is the vaccine that is the workhorse of their deployment plans. So let's look forward to this, Munir, and maybe in the questions we can explore how quickly we will unlock the power of pharmacogenetics here. We also want to unlock the power of our yellow card database. It's a very substantial pool of data now, many millions of reports. And the benefit of being a regulator is that we oversee all medicines in clinical use and vaccines in the UK market. We have expertise in biobanking. The stem cell bank is at the UK Stem Cell Bank is at the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control. And we have the expertise in data management at the Clinical Practice Research Data Link. So the scene is set to scope out a yellow card biobank. And we're at that stage and actively pushing forward. There's a certain date that's engraved on our hearts, which is the upcoming spending review, but let's hope that there are priorities around science, because now is the time to deliver. So what would this putative biobank do? It would collect and sequence DNA samples. At the moment, we've determined it would be a watch list of your concerns. And we have a list. I haven't put it here, unless it constrains the imagination. But we need to be able to home in on specific questions. That we will look at electronic health records to get the relevant phenotype data, and then the external research community would come to us to access anonymised records to be able to look further into how that particular link of interest is able to be researched. And the ultimate aim will be a battery of genetic screening tests that can further reduce the burden of adverse drug reactions, which really hasn't shifted from, I think, 6 to 7% of hospital admissions in the time I've been in this role. We plan to take forward more work internationally, and this is how I will end with looking forward to our international collaboration. To speed innovation and to make the UK the preferred environment to discover, develop and deploy, we need to have a market that will attract investment. As of the 1st of January, we're fully paid up equal partners with Australia, Canada, Singapore and Switzerland. We've focused on work on new actives and have introduced 32 so far for these countries. But now we need to move up a gear, look at cell and gene therapies, for example. And I can tell you from a telecon earlier this week, Australia, Canada, Singapore and Switzerland are absolutely up for it to make this market of 150 million a really attractive environment to introduce new entities. And of course, let's not forget that slide earlier with some of the cancer treatments, which go straight from our ILAP, as we call it, via the FDA orbis to reach another large population. Let's look at these opportunities internationally and really seize the moment, because now is the time. In particular, the G7 has given us a clinical trials charter, and I can tell you our Sir Patrick Vallance is reminding me weekly of how we're progressing with this. The International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities has established a working group. The word harmonisation is a little bit tired, but we need to remove barriers. When a virus moves from one country to another, the start-up for clinical trials, say moving from, I think it was the UK to Nepal, was just not what investigators needed. So we need much stronger collaboration on large-scale clinical trials, while not forgetting the recovery, resilience, growth agenda of more diversity in trials. Let's eliminate the duplication of effort that has gone on in the clinical trial space and COVID has exposed. And finally, we have a challenge. We have the Prime Minister's or the government's 100-day challenge laid out again as part of G7 Pandemic Preparedness Partnership. You take a deep breath when you think of what 100 days might mean across the piece for diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines. But it's only if we challenge our thinking, and each of us has a part to play, that actually we can do what Patrick has asked, which is make the exceptional every day. What is it that we did in the last 18 months that was exceptional that should now become the norm? And I think we're up for it. There are ways, particularly with my own organisation, to restructure, to rethink how people culturally approach their work. Don't wait, but initiate. There are all sorts of aspects to building back in the way that we want to, but making the exceptional every day. And so I hope I've summarised from the regulatory response to COVID that has introduced new thinking and new ways of working, how our regulatory world is up for a massive change. That we must never forget that public trust is at the basis of this. When the EMA looked at adaptive licensing, Hans-Georg Eichler introduced that, actually the public and patient groups across Europe were not convinced. And we mustn't forget that speed sometimes undermines confidence. But let's take the public on our journey as we embed our new approach to take time out of the procedures that we operate. And actually at the end, what three things matter? It's collaboration, collaboration, and collaboration. It's research, regulator, industry, all the other bodies involved in healthcare. Let's come together again and continue that spirit of collaboration actually for the future change we want to see. Thank you very much indeed.